can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I'm really excited for today's episode. I'm joined by Professor Mark Williams, who is a massive name in the field of expertise and skill acquisition and performance and sport, but actually across many domains. We're going to be talking about myths today in the area of sort of skill and performance. So, Mark, just before we start to get into that, just how are you? And again, just thanks so much for making time today.
Yes, my pleasure, Mark. Thanks very much for the invite to come and contribute to the show. And I'm looking forward to the difficult questions you're going to push my way.
Yeah. Even before we came on air as well, I mean, I must admit, as I say, like I learn all the time from you, Mark, in your work. Skill acquisition in sport is just one of the many books that you've either co-authored or edited. And I suppose for those that are listening, for a bit of context, just to put into real clear detail, just the level of experience that Mark has in this area. I think, and you can update me here, Mark, as well, but over 200 journal articles have been published in this space, with yourself included in them. You've had about 80 book chapters so far. You've, as I say, edited or co-authored, I think, 15 or over books as well in this area. So, you know, it's a lot of writing, it's a lot of thinking, which is no mean feat by any stretch of the imagination. So what I want to kind of chat about today is actually this conversations came in the back of 7 really interesting posts that you made recently on LinkedIn around myths in the area of sort of skill and performance. And we're going to kind of work through those myths maybe one at a time, just to add a bit of context to them, add a bit of elaboration where you feel that's required. And I'm going to sort of push some questions onto you that, being someone who has an awareness of these areas and has an enthusiasm for it, but always lacks some finer details that, you know, people who are much more in the know can help with understanding, and therefore our listeners as well can get the benefit of that. But maybe to sort of, before we get into that, let's chat about why did you make these sort of posts in the first place? Why should we care about, why does there need to be a conversation on myths and skill performance and learning? What sort of influenced that decision in the first place?
Yeah, I'd probably say a couple of issues. I mean, I see particularly on LinkedIn, perhaps, a lot of people advertising services and skills and use of methods that where I think the scientific evidence is not that strong. And I think probably the second factor is that from a societal perspective, we probably have a real difficulty these days in determining what actually is authenticity and who is an expert and who isn't. Because I guess everyone seems to be proclaiming themselves as an expert. But, you know, the reality is maybe our criteria for defining who is an expert and who isn't is a little bit loose. Now, obviously, everybody's out to an opinion. Of course they are. But at the same time, you know, where possible, if there is science that may contradict opinion, then technically that would be a myth in my perspective. So I think what I was trying to do is just to highlight where the science is strong and where there may be some level of disagreement between lay people's opinions or even people who proclaim to be experts and what science is telling us around those particular areas. I think that was my motive to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I find interesting about that is what I've certainly noticed in this sort of space is that, you have the academic conversations, and they in some respects are quite abstract. Sometimes that's what their intention to be, and it's not necessarily trying to inform practice, but rather maybe help us just understand underpinning mechanisms of things, which is fine. Then you've got another side, practical conversations, where it's, it's all about the doing and how, and often built upon experience and what, and sometimes the feel, maybe the art aspect of coaching, if we're linking this more to this vocation specifically. And now what I've seen is this emergence of pracademics, and I don't know if that sort of came out of a space of frustration, maybe, from people starting to see that there isn't this, for a long time there's always been this, how do we bridge the gap between academics and the real world? But I don't know if pracademics is a word in itself that sort of has that connotation of the frustration of what does this mean? Because there is sometimes bewildering the amount of language that is now available. And then I think as a coach, what you're trying to figure out is how can I use this? And there's so many contradictions. So where's the higher order information that I can use in order to sort of coordinate activities based on this? I don't know if that sort of resonates a little bit, but that's what I've felt a little bit.
For sure it does. I haven't used that particular term that often. I might have used it once or twice in some articles. But yeah, I certainly understand the underlying philosophy behind it. I guess for me, I started off as a football player at a reasonably high level. Sort of I was a youth international player, and then I played. I was on the books of a professional club for a number of years. Then I played semi-professional football, and then I coached also for a number of years. So I guess I started off as a coach and a player, and then became interested in the science, so to speak. I guess I'm always interested in the application of research, and I suppose a lot of my research has a very applied focus. And yes, sometimes I guess there are scientists out there who are very much driven more so by the theory. I agree, in certain areas in our field, then certainly we have very colourful language that I think probably can make it difficult for coaches to fully understand some of the underlying concepts. So I certainly empathise with the notion of pracademics and the fact that our responsibility, or part of our responsibility as scientists, is to make sure that the work that we do is digestible and easily applied by those working in professional domains like coaching.
Yeah. So let's start to kind of hash it out a little bit then. So we'll as I say, we'll go through each of the sort of myths, and I think they're really cool talking points, and then we'll see if you can help make further sense of what you were getting at, I think, when you started to add a bit of comment to them. So the first myth that you mentioned was around, and I'll kind of word it a little bit verbatim here, well, the ability to make decisions under pressure, this crucial expertise in many domains, sport included. The myth that is that superior performance in such contexts derives from the development of domain generic cognitive skills such as speed of information processing, working memory capacity, reaction time, and other executive functions. So what were you meaning by that? Specifically, what do we mean by domain generic cognitive skills? I think is a nice sort of way of accessing that conversation for those that are listening.
It's just the concept that, for instance, expert athletes don't have superior working memory capacity, for instance. They can't hold any more information in working memory than non-experts do. It's what they're able to do is they're able to use long-term working memory, or if you like, through prolonged exposure to the sport, they've developed knowledge structure in memory that allow them to synthesize that information and therefore, in essence, expand the capacity of working memory. The reason why this is important, I think, is that, see, the challenges is that some of these task generic skills, like working memory capacity, even reaction time, are quite easy to measure because they use sort of standard laboratory-based tests, many of which can be done on a laptop, for instance. So there's an ease in terms of their usage. And in contrast, some of the task-specific cognitive skills are much harder to measure. So task-specific skills means that the skills that are specific to a sport or a particular professional domain, and normally they involve sort of creating sport-specific stimuli that allows us to measure things like, the ability to anticipate, the ability to make decisions. So therefore, they're much harder to develop these kinds of test batteries, not least, of course, because they're specific to each sport. But the reality of it is that, these task-specific skills are much more predictive of elite performance than these task-generic skills. But as I said, the paradox is that because of the ease of measurement, there's a lot of people who are still measuring task generic skills, but not so many that are measuring task specific skills.
I could just, I suppose when you read journal articles, for example, where they're maybe trying to suggest some sort of not necessarily cause and effect, it's quite difficult to achieve that in a sense, but they're trying to, experiment on the use of a particular strategy or the means in which people are making sense or using, I don't know, as you say, working memory to have an effect on performance. Sometimes it isn't the most naturalistic settings, aren't they, either, that these experiments are done in. So that in itself, like reaction speed and clicking a button,
yes, correct,
at a certain time isn't the same as reaction speed when a ball is coming at you and how you pass before the opponent closes you down. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah. I think a good analogy to some degree is, this is going back, and the analogy has been used quite a while. There's a differentiation between hardware and software in balance. The argument is that experts don't really have superior hardware. They don't have a better computer per se with more working memory capacity or a faster processor. It's just that they have, in essence, better software. It's the software that they were using in order to process information that enters the system much more effectively.
So does experience trump? That's this experience what matters more then, to a degree?
I think that's the gist of it, really, in the sense that, and we've done an extensive review on this, by the way. I'm trying to remember, I think it's in Psychological Bulletin, but it might be in Psychological Review, where we've done a task analysis of the predictive utility of these task-specific and task-generic measures. And certainly you require sport-specific stimuli to be used in order to discriminate between elite and sub-elite athletes across a range of different domains. So I'm not saying that these task generic skills are irrelevant, but what I'm saying is it's probably not the core source of expertise. What happens, of course, is that through prolonged engagement in the sport, in the domain of expertise, we develop these knowledge structures in memory that allow us to process and to perceive information in a much more efficient and effective manner. So therefore, expertise arises through these adaptations and the development of these knowledge structures, rather than having superior hardware, if you like, or superior sort of task generic cognitive skills. But a lot of people push hard on this concept of measuring task generic skills, of course, because they are easy to measure. Mean that they have significant predictive utility, or that we should spend effort in terms of trying to develop these skills as opposed to trying to develop task-specific knowledge, for instance.
It's funny in a sense, because having that sort of conversation almost seem like it's moving in the opposite direction to the more cultural narrative that talent is about development. It's almost like if there seems to be this insistence on developing or measuring rather these sort of domain generic skills, doesn't that start to then move back into a space where it's all sort of nature over nurture, which again culturally then it seems a bit of a contradiction sometimes from that means of measuring stuff in an experiment to then how we actually popularise the way in which we should train, exercises in the real world. I don't actually necessarily think nature should be fully answer to that, and there's maybe an importance to recognise an element of hardware maybe, but it's just funny that it seems like almost like a bit of a U-turn when you describe those sorts of things, or perhaps it hasn't been meant in that way, I don't know so much, but
yeah, I'm not sure I was looking at it in that context.
Yeah.
I think there is some element there that fits in regards to, I guess the talent development environment is the key factor here, in the sense of the question is, how do we develop practice sessions? How do we develop exposure to the sport that allows for these adaptations to long-term working memory to occur? So therefore, we're not born with the ability to read the game, for it. These are adaptations that occur in regards to prolonged exposure to the performance environment. And therefore, from a skill development perspective, we've got to think about, well, what kinds of activities will facilitate the more rapid acquisition of kind of those.
It's interesting.
To be honest, we haven't really got any clear information about the nature-nurture aspects of the development of these types of skills. I don't dismiss the fact that there may be some genetic components that have an influence on how efficiently and effectively we develop these knowledge structures. But we don't know what those factors what the genetic components may be at this time, if they even exist. And what we really don't have either, to be fair, is we don't have any longitudinal research. So we've had cross-sectional research, looking at groups of elite athletes, for instance, at different age groups, under 8s, under 9s, all the way through to adult age groups, for instance. And clearly at each of those age groups, elite athletes have superior game intelligence skills, if you like, than their sub-elite counterparts. But because we haven't tracked the development of these skills over time, we don't know, for instance, that, if someone who scores well on these kinds of, or highly on these measures of perceptual cognitive skill at age 8, are they also going to score highly at age 14, 16, 18? And obviously the reverse argument is someone who perhaps doesn't do well on these measures of game intelligence, or these measures of task-specific skill, for instance. Does that mean that they won't do well later on in development? Someone might improve and develop these skills quickly. So we've really no longitudinal research that tracks how these skills develop over time. We've only got cross-sectional research that tells us that these skills are important at each stage of development. And we obviously know that these skills improve with age, probably as a corollary of the exposure to practice and the fact that, these knowledge structures will develop the more we engage in the sport over time.
And what's the main barrier to not having as much longitudinal work then? Is it just people dropping out? Is it getting that sort of prolonged access as such in terms of legacy data?
I mean, the main one is access, in the sense of, you need buy-in from, for instance, a football academy or a national association to begin to carry out these types of tests with athletes at an early age and to track them through. And really that access hasn't been there. I mean, you're right, there will be dropout. So you need a fairly large sample as well to ensure that you still have a reasonable sample by the end of the process. And of course, a lot of athletes, it's not just dropout from that specific testing. A lot of athletes drop out the sport, or players may move from one academy to the other, for instance. So it's just been very hard to get buy-in by the kinds of organizations that would have access to players that would make this kind of testing quite useful.
It's interesting, and as I've just spoke there's some things in terms of the overlaps and some of these myths that we're going to be talking through. And I like this one as a starting point because in some sense it starts to sort of give value to the role of experience and performance, where I think in contemporary practice, and we're going to then eventually come on to talk about the ecological dynamics view and things and constraint-led approaches to coaching. Sometimes I think there seems to be a bit of a narrative towards trying to downplay the role of memory and cognition and stuff like that. So we might come back to that, and it's just interesting as it starts to overlap a little bit here. So the next myth was, Mark, experts having superior visual function compared to non-experts. So is that not the case, and why is that, would you say?
No, I mean, I think that this is a similar myth to the task-specific, task-generic component or myth argument as well. I mean, obviously quite often you will hear the sports commentator go, the player's got a superb eye or great vision, which leads to the premise, of course, that means that they must have some kind of Superman levels of visual function. But in a fairly extensive body of research now, where people have measured differences in visual function, things like visual acuity, peripheral vision, color vision, depth perception, for instance, between elite and sub-elite athletes, there are no consistent differences. So again, the differences between elite and sub-elite performers are not due to superior visual function. In other words, the quality of the image that arrives at the back of the retina is pretty much the same across groups. The differences are more in regards to the manner in which that information is perceived and processed. So again, there are, through experience, we develop these perceptual cognitive skills through adaptations to memory and long-term working memory, which allows us to be able to read the game in advance, to anticipate what's going to happen before it happens. I guess the implications here is that there probably is unlikely to be any benefits to be gained by trying to improve levels of visual function beyond average levels of visual function. It's less clear, actually, if you test elite athletes, and it's quite often that elite athletes have visual defects. The question as to whether you then try and rectify that visual defect or not, I think is an interesting one. Because on the one side, of course, if the athletes are already performing exceptionally well and there doesn't seem to be an issue, then it's unclear to me as to whether we should try and modify that or not, which is a kind of an interesting question.
Okay, so like if, let's say, according to some sort of standardised or set criteria as to what we see as high quality use of visual perception in a sporting performance context, if athletes, let's say, aren't necessarily scoring high in that, but regardless they're being effective, is that just maybe it's not either alludes to more complexity, or it's just pragmatically speaking, it's not necessarily the best use of a coach's time, perhaps still focusing in on deficiencies that holistically and overall don't maybe have only negligible sort of difference in output, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would merit a discussion possibly with the sports scientists and the clinician who would be measuring aspects of visual function. But I guess it just remains unclear to me that if the athlete is performing exceptionally well already, whether that component of vision is actually therefore crucial to performance or not, and therefore whether it merits some kind of intervention or not. I haven't got a clear answer to that, but I suppose the riding issue that I'm putting forward is that certainly efforts to try and improve visual function beyond average levels of visual function, there is no evidence to suggest that would lead to any meaningful transfer in an improvement in performance on the sports field.
The reason why I think it's really relevant is both in terms of what it suggests about the language that we should use. There's also, it beyond just semantics, like language is actually really powerful, I think, for coaches and how it informs what we should look for, what we should do, the kind of conversations we have. And then also sort of as a result of that, the sort of practice that it builds from. So you hear a lot about reaction speed, but this seems like more of a conversation that we shouldn't, and again, maybe this is a case of software versus hardware. Again, like we shouldn't necessarily be training athletes towards reacting quicker or better, but rather train them on how they can perceive affordances or cues, depending on what side of the fence you sit on in that respect, in the environment, so they can anticipate. That word anticipation seems quite powerful in this.
Yeah, well, again, reaction time is a classic hardware measure again, and there are no differences between elite and sub-elite players in regards to reaction time. So that isn't a significant factor in sports performance. I mean, the differences are so small that it's not really a significant issue to spend consideration about. I mean, really, most of the tasks, but they're not reaction tasks, they're actually anticipation tasks. So you read in advance what's going to happen. So you therefore virtually eliminate the constraints of reaction time by anticipating what might happen. So that I don't think that's important. I mean, I think a similar debate that seems to be raging a lot at the moment, which I'm sure might be of interest to some of your readers, this concept of visual scanning. I mean, yes, there's some very nice research work that's been done in recent years that has highlighted the fact that elite midfield players in football, for instance, have much higher scanning rates. So in other words, they make more frequent rotations of the head to try and pick up the positions and movements of players off the ball. And then therefore, there have been a lot of people at the moment who are trying to increase visual scanning rate. Some of it using non-sport specific stimuli again, like having people respond to different colour flags that are raised in the periphery, which encourages players to play with a head up and obviously to rotate head more frequently. However, of course, I mean, while scanning may play a part in the process of perception and subsequent decision-making, there is a differentiation between looking and seeing. And what I mean by that is I may turn my head, which allows me to look in that particular direction, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm seeing the right information from that display.
Yeah, it's almost like, rather than thinking scan more, it's like make every scan count, isn't it? It's like we need to think more about the quality of scanning.
Again, it's about improving and developing those perceptual cognitive skills that underpin perception and decision-making in those environments. So things like the ability, for instance, to pick up information from the body shape of an opponent, postural cues or clues, if you like, the ability to recognize patterns and structure, the ability to use high-level predictive probabilities as to what might happen next. These are this is knowledge stored in long-term memory that allows us to anticipate and to perceive better what an opponent is going to do in those scenarios, what a teammate is even going to do in those scenarios. So I think we need to differentiate. And I think scanning has a role to play, but at the same time, equally, if not more so, we need to focus on, again, how do we develop this knowledge that underpins perception and decision-making in sort of these kinds of environments. So increasing scanning on its own, per se, isn't necessarily going to lead to a significant improvement in performance.
Yeah.
And the other point I'd like to make here, actually, is that there are at least two different subcomponents to the visual field. So the first is central vision, or what we call the fovea. And that accounts for the central 1 to 2 degrees of the visual field. So when we read, for instance, what we do is we move the letter or the word onto the fovea. So the fovea is responsible for highly detailed acute vision, whereas the rest of the visual field is made up of peripheral vision. And peripheral vision is more sensitive to motion, but not to detailed high acuity vision. So clearly in a performance sports situation, experts use both the fovea and the peripheral vision differently and more efficiently and effectively than less skilled players do. So there are times, for instance, where scanning could be lower. Scan rate could be lower in an elite player. So I'm thinking of a situation, for instance, where if you're a centre-back in football, you're on the edge of the penalty area. The opposition midfield player has got the ball, say, 15 yards in front of you, and is wanting to play a little through ball to one of the strikers. Then usually what a defender will do there is he or she will fixate on the ball or the lower body of the player in possession of the ball using the fovea, and will then use peripheral vision to monitor for movement. So in that instance, there's no widespread scanning per se. There is scanning from an attention perspective, in the sense that attention is being distributed across that visual field, but the head is static, stationary to a degree. So you don't, in that instance, you won't find that experts scan more so, but you may actually find that novices scan more because they're not really sure where to look, and they're about using peripheral vision. So they probably move their head a lot more in those situations. So we just have to be careful about how we interpret some of this data around scanning and how we feed it into subsequent training programs that attempt to improve sort of game intelligence skills, if you like.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because oftentimes, like you said, around the whole idea of scanning and how it's sort of it's very much promoted, and I think for good reasons. And I think you've alluded to that as well, because I think football's all. I'll talk in my own sport, football, and even more specifically, my own context with youth kids. Youth football. Yep. I think there is a real value to habits. So while you're maybe implicitly training their perceptions, their perceptual cognitive abilities, I think getting them into habits and it's quite a tangible means of getting them to recognise that the potential aid of scanning your environment and paying attention to your environment is the idea of how many times you scan. But a lot of times, and I've peddled this myself, you would often show that pro football player. I think I've seen one like Haaland, and it's like within 10 seconds he scanned 5-6 times. But he might not actually, in theory, be scanning to retrieve more information. He might be actually have got all the information he needs, but it's the habit of scanning that's still there. Yeah. I don't know that, and then that sort of leads itself as to why we say then, that we need to be more like Haaland. I wonder.
Listen. I think it's a great point. I'm not, as I've tried to convey, scanning I think is important because clearly experts do it more, so there's something to it. But we just need to be clear about the fact that scanning on its own or increasing scan rate is not necessarily going to lead to subsequent improvements in performance, unless we are also able to develop the knowledge base that underpins why they're scanning. And again, this instance, scanning allows you to look. Perceptual cognitive skills allow you to see. To probably focus on both aspects.
It makes me think a little bit about where potentially technology might take us, because I think we're now in a space where with virtual reality headsets now, players can now be plugged into these simulators, and coaches are now able to have conversations with players potentially and see how they see and what they're looking at, and having that dialogue could be really powerful potentially in this sort of area as to how we get that tension correct between scan is helpful, but how you get it, you making every scan count and all these other, things that come into it.
I certainly think that simulation and virtual reality technology offers us a lot of opportunities to increase repetition and practice opportunities in regards to the development of perception and decision-making skills. So I could be a strong proponent of the approach. I think the problem we have at the moment a little bit, though, is that most clubs, organizations, and this is not just in football, this is across the majority of sports, people get pulled in by the technology. They get impressed by the shiny new technology. But really, I don't know of any organization or club or association at the moment that has effectively integrated the technology with appropriate buy-in from the coaches and the practitioners to suitable focus on what I would call instructional systems design. And what I mean by that is, look, there are lots of unanswered questions in regards to, what type of training do we do with VR? What kind of stimuli do we present? Which perceptual cognitive skills are we trying to train? How do we structure practice? How do we provide instruction? How do we provide feedback? How do we integrate pressure into those kinds of training environments? How do we measure transfer from practice environments to real match play scenarios? And no one's really doing that. So I'm hoping that certainly if we look back in 10 years, that what you might find is that a number of these high-performance teams, hopefully a large number of them, will have better integrated this technology into their systems and processes. But at the moment, I am not aware of any organization globally who I would benchmark as using optimal methods and strategies in regards to the development of these skills. But, ultimately, I think it's a crucial area because, ideally what we want is a 21-year-old centre-back with the game intelligence skill of a 30-year-old centre-back. And, that's worth a lot of money in the transfer market these days. So then the question is, of course, we know these skills, these perceptual cognitive skills develop through experience and over time. But the question is, well, okay, how can we facilitate the more rapid development of these types of skills? What kinds of interventions may be beneficial so we can speed up how quickly these skills are acquired? And I think there's a huge potential there for making inroads, marginal gains, if you like, as some would say. But unfortunately, no one's really grasped the nettle in the manner that I think would make a significant difference. They could do, but at the moment, no one's pursuing the right agenda, I don't think, on that particular issue, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I just, to be honest, when I've looked at some of these companies, I suppose they do that. They do advertise them. Maybe it's telling that they advertise them in a bit of a catch-all way that it can be used for helping with rehabilitate injured players, can be used for decision making, can be used for technical skills. I have seen some activity. I think it might be coming out of Manchester. I might be wrong on that, but where there was an experiment done around heading simulators, and I think that it was like the heading simulators were able to predict performance in heading in the real activity. However, that's a technical skill and probably done in isolation as well, which is a bit different from this conversation about actually how the heading the ball at the right time in the right place and how do you anticipate those sorts of things and amongst all sorts of other variables. So yeah, it's an interesting.
Well, ultimately, the focus of the commercial companies that are developing and selling VR systems is to create the most realistic recreation of the match situation. That's their focus. The clubs obviously want an improvement in performance off the back of it, but then there are so many questions that remain unanswered around, how do we design training programs? Which of these different perceptual cognitive skills are we trying to improve? How are they best improved? And therefore, without that sort of evidence-based practice component to it, to be fair, and even an ongoing research and innovation component to it, we're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. And then we're unable to be sure in terms of whether these training interventions are working and how do we actually effectively measure. And some of these commercial companies have got to get people with a background in, I use the phrase instructional systems design, it could be skill acquisition, people who know a bit about optimizing practice and and developing these kinds of skills. So either the companies have got to get involved with some of those people so that they better design products that cater for the need of the sports organizations, or the sports organization has got to lead on that agenda along the lines of, look, we've got this great new technology which we think would be beneficial, but how do we use it? How do we use it optimally so that we're using evidence-based practice to ensure that there are some real gains that could be made from using this type of technology?
Yeah.
Probably that question applies the same for a lot of technology measures in high-performance sport, to be fair.
Yeah. It's an exciting time we're in, actually, in the sense that we can chat about it, but I think that is true. We need to probably be quite careful that we don't take it on just face value alone, because it's fancy and glitzy, and it makes you appear modern and innovative to use them, isn't it, as well?
Well, and to some degree, it's difficult for these sports organizations, isn't it? When they get approached every day by a commercial company wanting to sell some product, it's easy to be pulled in by the glitz and glamour of the technology, so to speak. But then, who's making the judgments around? It comes back to my point at the very start. What is authenticity? What is expertise? And someone's trying to sell something to you, and you're thinking, well, is this going to work or not? How do I know? So, certainly the big sports organizations are probably at the point where they should all consider employing, sort of, whether it's full-time or part-time role, some kind of head of research and innovation who best guide them in terms of whether the technology that's being offered to them is going to make a difference and can be appropriately integrated into the systems and structures that underpin elite athlete development.
Because I actually think sometimes it's almost, I think sometimes sport clubs or organisations, I think they either look at this in terms of its clinical or practice relevance, or looking at it as a form of social capital, because I think almost as well you can kind of pride yourself of being different to other people, and just having these different bits of kit is sometimes a reason why people want to have them, and there's no other reason for than the social capital element of it, which is...
Oh, no, and of course the reverse as well, in that once one club buys one, then everyone else has got to buy one, even though they don't really know how they're going to use it and what benefit it's going to be, because they're not driven by research and innovation. They're driven by the fact that it's fancy technology, we need that. And of course the players like it, because it becomes a game, doesn't it? They put it on their head and they go, wow, this is incredible. But, I think we need to go beyond that. I think we need to make sure that we can use this, whatever the technology is, to make a significant difference. And that needs to be, where possible, evidence-based. Sometimes the evidence doesn't move quickly enough, but then I think clubs need to be aware of that, and they can maybe still make some best guess judgment as to the potential benefit, whilst at the same time trying to gather the evidence that would support continued use of that approach.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Modeling towards.
Yeah. So this the next myth, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on this one, around the idea of transferers still being a match to specificity of training, and you argued against that. So let's get into that. What was your perspective there?
There are different levels, aren't there? I suppose I'm going to make 2 points really. Firstly, there's a lot of intuitive, anecdotal evidence around the fact that you see a lot of elite athletes say, well, I used to play this sport when I was a child, and this has helped me in this other sport. So the concept of whether there is transfer of skill across sport, the problem is there isn't a lot of empirical evidence that identifies what exactly transfers and how much exposure to the donor sport, if you like, is needed to facilitate expertise in the target sport for expert performance. The only thing we know really from the science perspective is that the more similar two tasks are, the concept of similarity of cognitive processing, or what they call identical elements in terms of components of the skill, the more similar two sports, the more likely there is to be transfer. So, for instance, you could say that it's more likely to be transfer from field hockey to soccer because they use, it's 11-a-side, it's an invasion sport, they use similar systems and structures possibly than they might be, for instance, from field hockey to volleyball, which are very different types of sports. So that is part of the problem. We don't know exactly what would transfer at a kind of an anecdotal level. I can see that psychological skills might transfer. Maybe things like self-confidence, grit, resilience, mental toughness. It makes sense that they would transfer across sports and maybe even across domains. But again, the evidence is not overly conclusive or strong.
We're on the side of maybe not necessarily skill transfer, but like movement competency. So if we're thinking about I don't know, like proprioceptive awareness or like these sort of balance and that's like, because again, that's sort of like, is there more maybe transferable value there, similar to the sort of mental strategies again that you can pick up psychosocially, like someone doing judo, for example, who is a football player. Are they learning about posture and space and use of space in terms of bodily, control in a way that has maybe a little bit more carryover? Not necessarily that it goes as harmonious as the whole classic example of, oh, you start to know how to leverage your weight against an opponent, so that's going to make you a better striker. Like that's the part that's a bit of a stretch, but is the sort of movement,
I mean, again, the empirical evidence isn't strong if it's there at all on that concept. I suppose an alternative argument is, well, could you not create that variability within the sport itself? Therefore, are there advantages to going outside the sport to develop other skills? So, I mean, listen, my broad view on this issue is that scientists have identified at least 3 pathways to excellence in sport. One is the early specialization pathway, where people engage in one sport and one sport only throughout development. The other one is the diversification pathway, where you participate in a wide variety of different sports early on and specialize later on. Another pathway that we propose is the early engagement pathway, and this is the one that's typically used in football. Football players engage in sport very early, typically around 4 years of age, but they do participate in other sports. Although it's not huge, they participate in average of 3 other sports. And the hours that they accumulate in those other sports is no more than 5 to 10% of the total time that they accumulate in sport. So my argument would be is that in some sports which are culturally extremely popular, like football, for instance, then I do think you need to engage early, or else you're going to end up in a practice deficit of sorts somewhere down. However, it is then up to the child as to whether he or she wants to participate in as many other sports as they wish. I wouldn't dissuade them from participating in other sports. I'm not sure I'd necessarily encourage them either. I'd kind of say, look, it's your choice. What do you want to do? I mean, to some degree, I guess maybe I might encourage them slightly to get a bit of diversity because, of course, not many kids will reach the elite level, less than 1% for sure. So, and ultimately, maybe what for most kids they're trying to get out of the sport is the fact that they accumulate a lifetime of skills that will lead them well from a physical activity, healthy aging perspective. So maybe that's the disadvantage of the early specialization for sure, and to a lesser extent early engagement. But I'm not sure I would work towards transfer. So I wouldn't be working on the basis of the fact that, let's play field hockey because it will improve our football. I just play football. If you want to improve football, play football. And then if you want to participate in other sports, great. They may be transferred, they may not. We don't know what transfer, so there's no point in specifically sitting down and working on that.
And it makes a lot of sense almost in a way that it's not almost trying to like reject it, but it's just basically saying don't mix these things. So like physical literacy is really important for, lifelong participation in sport. So a kid can, for those reasons alone, learn different movement competencies by doing different sports. That's fine. That's for a different reason. That's not as necessarily saying it with the intention it's to improve the skill across sports either. It's just that it has an overall, benefit perhaps in the same way soft skills maybe can be transferred, a little bit better, like direct determination, but it's just not trying to, don't we have a habit? It's a human nature habit that we want to find connections all the time. So it makes sense when you watch someone who's played netball try a layup in basketball and you notice some weird ways in which they're doing it, that it makes sense to go, that must have a bit of a helping hand. And maybe it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we must train netball before we are alongside basketball in order to help. It's just as it is.
I mean, it's one of those that I guess the challenge is, if I'm wearing my hard scientist hat, in the sense that I'm not sure the evidence for me is not tremendously strong around this concept of broad developments of physical literacy at early age. Even the concept of, are there key time windows for the development of physical literacy skills, for instance? I was doing a review a few years back, and I I got stuck on it. I couldn't find any literature, and I asked a couple of well-known motor development people, what do you think of this? And they said there isn't any evidence, and I can't find it. Arguably, it makes sense at an intuitive level, but in terms of if you go and look at the scientific literature in the hope of finding some really hard evidence that will guide you towards what exactly needs to be done and why is it crucial and at what stage of development does it need to be done, it's just not there. It's just not.
And again, maybe it speaks a little bit to that, just the way things are peddled. Because again, I think about like that judo example, that comes from an old video I remember watching of Ajax, you know, who were having their players doing judo and things like that. You see a lot of Premier League clubs where the kids are taking the like movement parts during the week and stuff, and and that like you said, it's that intuitive level where you go, this must make sense, so it must be correct. But what we're actually seeing here is the evidence is actually weak. It's more anecdotal, and that can always be trusted.
And I've had that conversation with some academy manager, and I said, why are you doing that? And it's purely anecdotal, it's intuitive, and I don't know. I mean, I suppose the evidence would be stronger around increasing the amount of variability through the main sport. How can we further increase variability? Even actually, I mean, I'm not arguing strongly against differential learning, going outside the football, but still with the ball and still with the context of football to create that variability. And I'm less convinced as, we can't get enough variability within the context of football, so let's go and play volleyball or rugby or hockey or whatever, and then that will improve our football. And I'm thinking, well, there's really no evidence. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that participation in another sport will improve your performance in the target sport for expertise more so than practice in the performance sport for expertise. There may be transfer, but it's incidental.
And practically speaking as well, like coaches who get limited bandwidth, so we're always, there's only so many things we can focus on at once. And while there's this idea of we need to make a variable environment, what coaches have been given in more recent times is the tools through a more constraint-led approach to things, or like you said, the sort of like franchise methodologies like differential training and things like that. So maybe we do need to, as coaches, just get better at doing what we're already doing and not worrying about and having these additional activities. I see it really good at the football coaching session and not or the rugby session, not the judo and football thing together. So
See, I suppose for me, I'm a big proponent of specificity, and I'm going to take it to another level here in the sense that this concept of transfer and specificity also applies, of course, to a specific practice session in a single sport. So if I'm a football coach and I'm taking that practice session, listen, I've got two things in my mind. Specificity is on the one hand. So how do I create practice environments which mimic the demands of competition? Technically, tactically, physically, psychologically, because the closer my practice looks and feels like competition, the more likely there is to be transfer. So I want transfer, but at the same time, I want repetition. Because really what we want is practice sessions that are high in repetition and high in specificity. But then it's very hard to create those types of practice sessions. So normally what we do as coaches, of course, we sacrifice some degree of specificity for increased repetition. In fact, the whole concept of drills and grids is based around this notion. We isolate a component from the game, put it into a drill grid type situation, which means we can increase repetition. The problem with that, of course, is that it's great that we're increasing repetition, but do we reduce specificity too much in so much as what we're then practicing doesn't transfer back into the game because we've reduced the specificity? Practices, for instance, that don't have decision-making as part of the component. I mean, I can even take it to another extreme in the sense that there's a lot of evidence now, for instance, that suggests that when we're under pressure, whether that's through anxiety, mental fatigue, physical workload, we process information differently. So our gaze behaviors change, how we use the fovea and peripheral vision changes, how we prioritize the use of information changes, our technical execution of skill changes. So then if we have practice environments which don't have those pressures and the same physical, psychological workload that we have during competition, then what are we actually practicing? And to what extent does that practice transfer or not back into the match situation?
Yeah, had me thinking a little bit about, I think it's cognitive psychology. It talks a little bit about that around your sort of emotional balance, will impact your ability to concentrate. It was talking a little bit of implications maybe from how your working memory therefore can take in information, how it can control the likelihood of it then encoding out longer term memory and things like that. It all has a connection. I wonder if that's a nice segue, just to, we're on the point here about representative practice design, or again making these compromises sometimes on repetition and for specificity. Because we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think this is worth doing. So you made one of the other myths that you spoke on, Mark, was around the idea that performance in practice infers still learning is taking place. And is that maybe relevant here in the sense that sometimes we see players doing well at practice, but does that mean they're doing better at the sport? It just might mean that they're doing better at the exercise, but novelty and transfer matter. So can we get into that if that links up well at this stage?
And again, this is not my opinion. There's a lot of empirical evidence around this.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you take a coaching session, whatever the sport, whatever the age of the kids, what you see in that practice session is their observed behavior. Now, their observed behavior is their performance there and then in that session. So it's not learning. In order to make inferences that learning has taken place, firstly, you need to measure retention. So you need to be able to see that the change in performance that you see during practice is retained into subsequent practice sessions over time. And then secondly, you need to be able to measure transfer. So in other words, that the change in performance that you see in practice transfers into other practice sessions. And of course, the ultimate measure of transfer is whether it transfers into competition and match play itself. And so therefore, performance and learning are not the same things. They're different. Therefore, the challenge for coaches, and the reason why this is such a difficult task for coaches, is that therefore what you see in practice is not necessarily what you get as far as learning is concerned. So we know, for instance, that if we want the best performance during a practice session, then if you demonstrate provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice of single skills, and provide lots of feedback, then performance is better. Performance, sometimes, of course, maybe the focus is on performance, because if performance is better, self-confidence is higher in the players, motivation to continue participation is increased. But I think mostly the focus on coaching should be on long-term learning. And if we want to promote learning, then the evidence is quite clear again that maybe the philosophical approach from the coach will be, what is the least amount of information that I need to give the learner so that the learner can begin to practice the skill? To what extent are my practice conditions dynamic and variable such that they reflect the demands of competition? High specificity again, or physically, physiologically, technically, tactically, psychologically. And finally, what is the least amount of feedback that I need to give the player so that he or she can begin to problem solve on his or her own? So much more hands-off approach to instruction, I guess. And whilst that may not necessarily create the best performance during practice, the evidence is quite clear that facilitates better the retention and transferability of skill, i.e. learning over time.
The
challenge for the coach is that the coach is therefore always making inferences about long-term player development. And you can get a session that looks great and performance is good, but it may not necessarily be that much learning is taking place. I can have a performance that doesn't quite look great, or practice doesn't quite look great. Things are not going quite as you planned, but it doesn't mean that learning hasn't taken place. You cannot make that inference. You have to wait to see how that progression over time occurs. Therefore, it's very difficult for coaches, I think.
The thing is as well, I wonder if that tracks into competition as well, because I think well-intentioned coaches, they evaluate their training week based on the outcome and the result of how they perform on the park, let's say on the Saturday or Sunday. But then again, if they forget how impactful sometimes that sort of our feedback in the moment, so we sometimes talk about the joystick coach who's calling every single pass. You might see a really great sequence of play, tactically or even technically. The players might individually show that an element of what they're doing that looks really, really good. But I suppose when you then temper that with the sort of zone of proximal development at play there, like you're not only ever seeing where they could be once they reach a stage of real self-regulation that they're actually able to do that themselves, but at the moment you are still scaffolding that for them. So you're inferring it based on evidence that is actually sort of biased, or biased, but it's leading itself to its own conclusions, because you're impacting that performance by being there and having that aid to the athlete.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there is an element of periodization that's required here. And again, there hasn't been a lot of empirical work on this topic either, in the sense of, are there times within the training schedule that you need to focus on performance, and then times that you need to focus on learning and development? And yes, there are. I mean, clearly, if I've got a game tomorrow, then today, maybe it's all about performance, because I want the players to feel good, for confidence to be high going into tomorrow's game. But other times, then clearly you also need to have a focus on long-term skill development. So how you balance out those two different emphases.
Yeah. But it goes back to what you say, isn't it? It's the tension. This is the thing for me. Like, drills are easy to gang up on until you start to consider things like habits or confidence, and recognizing that sometimes you need to prioritize now at the expense of later. Overarchingly, however, like the macro level, the long-term view is best. But I always recognize that I think in my own practice, if it's not that I necessarily think a drill's optimal in terms of for full self-regulation, what I do think they can be helpful for is habits. And again, habits can across time help sometimes towards other things. Now, consciously, obviously, I'm quite conscious of the fact that that's a field-based assumption again, but there's these elements, and then I think we also need to consider is how athletes feel and they're receiving your training too. So there's weird things at play there. I think the tensions, and that's always the hard part. I think where there's sometimes that gap between maybe a skill acquisition view on things and the coach thinks, is that the coach is dealing and making decisions at a higher order level that isn't always able to, in isolation, respect what's optimal in that capacity as well. But
I mean, drill itself has connotations of being a bad word, isn't it? It's almost like a dirty word. I mean, of course, the first question, what is a drill? I mean, I'm not sure if there's a formal definition of it. I mean, I would say that a drill scenario typically allows practice with high levels of repetition. So in that regard, there are some positive aspects to drills. I think the key point is, do they maintain a suitable level of specificity? And then if your drill environments are moving us away from the match environment in terms of its demands on technique, tactical, strategic aspects, decision-making, then you have to wonder, well, what are we practicing something different here, which therefore won't transfer to an improvement in performance in the sports field? And therefore what we end up being led by is that, this is good performance. The players are playing well. I must be a good coach. The parents are loving it. Everyone's happy. But then is there actually meaningful transfer and retention of skill, learning that is occurring out of that session?
Yeah. So it's a dosage thing, isn't it? It's like, a little bit can be fine when it's the purpose behind it. And it's maybe it's to help with, meeting the tensions. But should a football session be, completely compartmentalised and modularising the performance and reducing it to a drill? No, because that's not representative of the game, isn't it? So it's that little. I think too often, it's just drill at any time bad, and I always think that's a bit unfair sometimes to the need to recognise the tensions and things, and just where what's optimal isn't what's best for the situation at any one time, isn't it? That's that tension that has to be had.
And of course, some element of repetition is important for skill learning. So I'm not saying that repetition isn't important. To be clear, what I'm saying is that when coaches always have the choice between what levels of specificity am I creating and how much repetition am I creating. And my argument would be focus more so on specificity over and above repetition. Because if the levels of specificity drop to too low a level, yes, you're getting high repetition, but what are you actually practicing? And the potential for transfer there is much reduced. So I'd rather do high specificity, low repetition than low specificity, high repetition.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And it's very simple That's smart. Whenever you go and watch a practice session, just ask yourself the question, does this drill, whatever it might be, does it feel and look like the game situation? Is this what it's like in the game? And then if it is, then you can genuinely say, well, there's a good chance that they might be transferred. But if it doesn't, then we think, what are we practicing? We become very good at doing this, but what is going to be the transfer of that practice into match play?
It's like everything, isn't it? You get good drills that can be quite functional and even at least understood in their own way as being useful to a point, but you really bad ones as well. So, you still can be pushing coaches to get better at doing a drill because they need to be wary of the fact that they're already perhaps in the land of probabilities doing more disservice than they are helping to a point, perhaps. So they really need to make sure it's good. Yeah. So maybe we need to focus on high quality drills, not the removal of them.
Yeah,
and then the doses.
Or just ensuring that every drill has a sufficient level of specificity to them.
Yeah. So next one, and I'm curious.
What's these rondos? Rondos, they've been used a lot in coaching, haven't they, over the last few years? I mean, sometimes I look at some of them and I kind of wonder, well, again, the patterns of movement of the ball, for instance, don't always replicate the match situation. Performance, the more the players practice that, the better they're going to become at it. But is that the way the game functions? Because normally you have a proposed direction of travel, for instance, to up the field, albeit with some deviations left, right, and backwards. But in the rondos, from some of the ones I've seen, there's no real direction of travel. You're just trying to maintain retention of the ball, for instance. So you have to think, what's the transferability there?
I couldn't agree more. I think rondos as well, I think they're a good example that not every game-based practice is necessarily representative practice, because a rondo, by the fact that it's dynamic, looks and would feel from the outside, it has to be good, but you are essentially, and I appreciate for people outside the football, this might not have so much relevance to them, but you are essentially in a square, passing the ball sideways, unless you ensure that there is elements of people stepping into the play or there's a direction towards it. Actually, it doesn't help. There's movement, so maybe it's better than people being still, but is there that much movement? There's some variability, but is there good variability? So it's like, it's just an interesting way to push people to think harder about why they do certain things. This is great. So the next one I would want to get onto, Mark, was neuroscience then, because this idea of, is neuroscience the answer? And I think you had a bit more of a critical eye there. So I'm quite intrigued to know what's your thinking at the moment in this space.
Well, I think that what triggered that particular myth is, again, there were a lot of companies out there promoting neuroscience methods as an instant fix on certain issues, like, some work around penalty kicks, for instance, that we can take EEG recordings of your penalty when you're taking penalties in training, and we can use that to develop training programs. Again, the empirical evidence is not there. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a big supporter of neuroscience. I could say it probably hasn't quite delivered as much as I thought it would have done if we went back 10, 15 years ago and neuroscience was the next big thing. I mean, it's made a contribution to our knowledge and understanding of expertise and learning, but not as much of a contribution as I think might have been hoped going back 10 or 15 years ago. Part of the problem, of course, is our measurement systems, whilst they're continually improving, but still our capacity to collect neuroscience data in real life scenarios and in training as a practice is quite difficult. Whilst we're getting there, it's been a very, very slow process. So again, what we probably lack is a form of evidence-based practice, in the sense that the evidence is not strong enough for us to say, yes, if we can collect EEG and these penalty kick scenarios, yes, we can identify successful and unsuccessful signatures, and we can develop training interventions off the back of that. Some people are selling those products, and some clubs are buying into them. But if you look at the scientific literature, it's not there to support that kind of work. So I think that currently is a bit of a myth. The other difficulty with, maybe not difficulty, but the issue we've had with neuroscience has a lot of potential, for instance, in regards to longitudinal research on learning and potentially identifying neural markers of the efficiency of learning, for instance. But generally, that kind of research, again, hasn't been done, mainly because it's costly, and access to participants to do longitudinal work is different. So I suppose what I was trying to convey with that particular myth is, again, I think when these companies and organizations approach professional clubs and say, look, we've got this new neuroscience method and this is going to make a massive difference to you, I think the clubs need to take a step back and either seek advice from experienced scientists in the area and look at the research literature. Is the research literature there that would support the use of these kinds of interventions? I mean, of course, I do totally accept the fact, Mark, that, and I remember having a conversation once with a very high-level coach, and the debate went something along the lines of, there's no empirical evidence to suggest that this kind of intervention would work, I said to the coach. And the coach turned around to me and said, but it's not going to do them any harm, is it? And I said, probably not. I don't think so. And he said, with any busy training program, he said, there is scope to do stuff that is innovative, and maybe you can have a placebo effect.
That's interesting.
I sit back and, no, we don't want to do anything unless we can demonstrate empirically that it's got some kind of benefit. But then I can see some logic to that argument as well. And in regards to, for instance, maybe one of the Premier League clubs has been doing this kind of EEG support with penalty kicks, of course, in recent years, and they had some notable successes. So maybe there's a bit of a placebo effect there, that the players think, we're getting this special treatment. It means we're going to be better at taking penalty kicks. So therefore, it increases self-confidence, self-efficacy in those situations, and it has a benefit. But as I said, the empirical evidence is not there, I don't think, to fully support the use. So we've got to be careful. And I think this is where the clubs have a duty of care to the players and the owners of the clubs, that they're not spending money just for the sake of it. And they need to make that there is empirical evidence to substantiate the benefits of these types of interventions.
But that's what's so, I think, important about that, is that sometimes we forget that different discipline-specific knowledge evolves at different rates, but because it all feeds into the same big monster of sport, and because it feeds into the sort of almost, agenda, in which we need to constantly try and innovate and move ourselves away, it's like it doesn't really matter so much nowadays to the club as to how much research has been done on any given topic. It's lumped in the same way that our topic that's had 40, 50 years of research is also accepted. Because I wondered if this sort of goes back to maybe the first myth around the sort of the main generic cognitive skills, because when we get into neuroscience, it is hardware. Yeah. And it's almost like, I wonder, it's almost, I had a really great episode with Laura Carey looking at some of this around understanding like bandwidths and stuff like that during golf putting performance, and it's one of these sorts of things where it's a very important academic topic, but it's only aimed at, and again, I don't think work should be criticised for being incorrectly applied, but it's only aimed at understanding further the mechanisms, because at this stage of evolution, that's where we're at, and I'm not actually at the stage where we can actually reliably give practical advice on it. We can infer as coaches, but we need to be careful what inference means. And again, then you get caught into all this argument, the placebo and stuff like that. But is it actually the best investment of resource potentially? Is it, and are companies taking advantage of that, maybe naivety to a point?
Yeah, no. I mean, you certainly raised some good points there. I mean, I guess clearly all the sports organizations are looking for the next magic bullet. And of course, it's often perceived that technology provides that missing bullet, so to speak. But I suppose the problem is then the clubs take up that technology, but then they don't have the right systems and structures to fully implement programs of work around that. And then invariably what happens quite often or not is that a few months later, that technology is not being used, or the consultancy contract that they put into place is no longer functioning. I mean, on the one side, I'd like to say there is so many good science that's been done over the last 50 years that is still not being implemented in the clubs. Thing around optimizing the use of practice time, for instance, and this differentiation between performance and learning, and how do we develop practice sessions high in specificity, high in challenge. A lot of that research hasn't been sufficiently well implemented. So maybe the clubs should do more in terms of capitalizing on the research base that already exists. But I think at the same time, clubs need to be investing more in research and innovation. And of course, I have a little bit of an agenda. I haven't got an agenda. It's just what I'm interested in. It's my core beliefs, in the sense that at the end of the day, most of the Fortune 500 companies, for instance, invest between 3 and 5% of their GDP on research and innovation, because they want to stay ahead of the game. how much money is your average Premier League team spending on research and innovation? Relatively small. And I would probably argue that some of them make no investment at all in research and innovation. So really, if I see a new growth area, I see an opportunity for clubs to bring people on board with a research and innovation background, or to link more constructively with their local universities, so that they are moving more strongly towards a culture which is evidence-based. And they also need to accept the fact that you can't often have a quick fix solution to these issues. Sometimes research takes time. And of course, I can see the demands on clubs to have immediate success, particularly at senior management level. But then, there needs to be people in the club who are looking at the development of the club from a short-term, medium-term, and long-term perspective. And therefore, they need to be probably looking at research and the use of technology across those three agendas. What can we do now? What can we build for the future? And what might be the long-term future from a research and innovation perspective, so that our club can be cutting edge and can benefit from real science and how that impacts on performance. And I don't think, to my knowledge, any club has those types of structures in place. It's all very haphazard. It's all reactive. And consequently, there's a lot of money that's potentially wasted. I mean, I don't think the cost of putting in a systematic, bringing someone in with a research and innovation background and putting it, and again, this same point applies to football association. I don't think any of the football associations have a strong research and innovation component either. And I come to that point. Fortune 500 companies, 3 to 5% of their GDP goes on research and innovation. What proportion in sports organizations of the money GDP goes into research and innovation?
Yeah. And I was trying to ask the question, actually I should probably clarify first, actually, when I was referring to a previous guest, it was actually looking at brainwave frequencies, but really interesting stuff. But come back to this sort of how we utilise it and thinking more about companies as such. I'm curious to know, what's your thoughts on, and this might go back again to the first myth around hardware kind of arguments, but IQ, like that's one of these things. I hear like IQ testing happening now with football players and things like that, in order to be able to sort of predict apparently maybe, future outcomes or their capacity to do well.
Yeah.
Is that one of these things that, again, because I see that word and neuroscience attached to it and stuff. So
one of those things again where someone with a background in IQ testing will have approached the club and said, look, you need to do IQ testing, and the club go, yeah, you're right, we need to do IQ testing. Empirical evidence? No. There was some work done in the 70s where they did actually find that quarterbacks in American football had higher levels of IQ than other positions. But I would doubt whether IQ would have any predictive utility, because IQ and game intelligence are probably not correlated. Or I suppose the problem is, to some degree, is again, we don't have systematic testing and we don't have longitudinal testing. So, there's a lot of research work, cross-sectional stuff, again, comparing elite to sub-elite within age groups. And like we know, by way of example, that elite players have high levels of mental toughness, high levels of self-efficacy, high levels of grit, high levels of mental resilience, high levels of achievement motivation. But then we don't know, well, do they come in with high scores on those attributes to start with? Or to what extent are those attributes developed over time by the environment? And we don't know how predictive they are in terms of performance. Now, I would put IQ into the same category. In fact, I would probably put IQ into a weaker category, because to my knowledge, there is no published peer-reviewed research that demonstrates that elite footballers have higher IQs than sub-elite footballers.
And again, it's one of those ones, isn't it, where there's the risk of something's going down a path, and I think this is something that maybe still acquisition researchers can be complicit in, where not to mean it to or whatever, but that idea that we're trying to almost reduce performance and development to being this sort of formula. Whenever you have people or humans involved in that is going to always be problematic, because an athlete is unique in themselves and we're all complicated, and that's wherever you start from isn't where you end up at, and there's all these other factors, like alongside IQ we've got EQ, so your emotional intelligence, all these other things that are all going to play a role. I think there's what I do appreciate the value, and I think to a point here is when people are trying to do something different, we won't know more until we have more research, and we oftentimes won't get more research until we see more happening in the field itself. So I think that is why, like, we need it. It's just part of evolution, but it's like, well, we're still finding out more. The sensible approach should probably be not to put all your eggs in one basket with it, isn't it? So, yeah, which is interesting. So, I wonder if this sort of, I think we've kind of already got onto this about the idea about that the other myth was that we're getting closer to having a sort of reliable predictor of future performance in sport, that we're getting closer to this, talent ID, the best form of it, and this sort of idea. But I think what we've got to so far is that's just isn't the case still. We aren't really moving much further in that respect. Is there anything we need to add further onto that perhaps you haven't captured already?
No, I mean,
I think we're there.
I mean, having said that, I mean, I am working with one of the UK universities at the moment, and there is a partnership agreement in place with one of the Premier League teams, and we are looking to develop multidisciplinary longitudinal test batteries that will begin to better evaluate whether any of these measures have any predictive utility over time. I mean, if I was being a cynic, I'd say that I don't think there are any clear predictors of talent. But at the same time, the empirical evidence does need to be stronger. So we have a relative absence of multidisciplinary and longitudinal research that tracks out, how predictive some of these physical, physiological, technical, tactical, psychological predictors of performance are, and which of them are predicted utility, and how much variance in performance do they predict or not. Well, I think the research needs to be done. I'm less convinced that we'll come out of it with clear predictors, but I still think the empirical work needs to be done.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, all the sports have some kind of talent ID model, and if you go around the conferences, you'll see sports present their talent ID model. I mean, if you ask them how much of the variance in performance, i.e. selection and deselection, is accounted for by the model, they probably won't know, because they're not doing that kind of longitudinal tracking. So most of these talent ID models are more intuitively driven than they are driven by empirical evidence.
And I suppose there's limits, isn't there, on what can really ever be captured anyway, because there's always going to be unknowable bits in between. Like, we talked something, and it was actually a really cool paper. I had a conversation in a previous episode with Alan Nichol, who did a paper around the relationship between coach and practice and athlete outcomes. And like, again, just the idea of we can't really establish cause and effect because we need to control for a lot of different things. Obviously, talent ID sort of looks outside of that. It's also a macro level of taking away the coach, or not necessarily taking away the coach, but adding other variables into it. But even then, there's always going to be something lost in the data. So empirically, we need to work towards stronger predictors and trust to a point. But we don't even really know if coach is effective. Just don't really know if anything is actually the reason why, this happened. There could be so many other variables haven't been accounted for. And it's
I think that's always the starting point for this type of research, isn't it? And the first question is, well, okay, what are we going to measure?
Yeah.
And of course, let's talk about it from a psychology perspective. And then, as I said, you could decide to measure some of those variables I mentioned before: grit, mental toughness, resilience. And then you choose, say, half a dozen of these psychological measures or characteristics that you're going to measure. And then invariably, you then do the longitudinal research. And the problem you might have, of course, is down the line is you find out, that those 6 measures were not as predictive as you thought they were going to be. And then, of course, it wouldn't take long to come up with an alternative 6 measures. So then you keep going around this concept of what do we actually measure? And how do we know that those measures are discriminatory or not? And then in some areas, particularly technical and tactical measurement is problematic. In the sense that, for instance, we can measure tactical aspects of the game like anticipation and decision-making using film-based tests or even VR-based test environment. But then, how high are they in terms of external validity, for instance? I mean, are they strong enough measures, and how can we measure those kinds of skills in a performance match kind of scenario? It's the same for technical ability. We can use skills-based measures, of course, for technical ability, but then to what extent are they representative of the application of those technical skills within match scenarios? So we do have, issues around measurement sensitivity that we're continually working on. And of course, our measurement sensitivity is improving. But again, because of the general lack of access and the fact that most of the work has been mono rather than multidisciplinary, and that most of the work has been cross-sectional rather than longitudinal, our understanding of talent ID is probably not as advanced as we might hope it is. It's clearly a crucial area again, and we're in that, rush back to that discussion from a few minutes ago in the sense of, what are the priorities of the club? They have to see talent ID as a medium to long-term process. So what research do we need into place that may increase our understanding of the process and may, over a period of time, have some impact in optimizing the selection and the development of players within that framework? But everyone wants a quick fix, and there is no quick fix. So you need people with vision in those leadership positions to put those processes and systems into place, which are not expensive. When you might think, we don't want to put research and innovation into place because it's expensive, but you could put an exceptionally good world-class research and innovation program into place for, I would say that 10% of the budget that a Premier League club has recently wasted on the getting rid of one head coach and bringing in a new head coach. I think you've got to look at it from that perspective, really.
Yeah, plus from a sort of strategic overview perspective as well, like, because, as I say, there's predictive markers and these sorts of things, but because there is an element of unknown, I always think a concentrated effort is comparable to optimized effort, if you want to call it that. So, like, well, there might be smarter ways of working. I think I totally understand why a company or a club or organisation wants to really commit to a specific purpose and do that as best they can, because in some senses that can be what's best, because even if, yes, there's evidence, this and that, actually, having everyone with the buy-in and the commitment to do it gets sometimes to be really advantageous. So, like, there's all those different reasons for doing it, not doing it, and, you can go back and forward. But yeah, it's just being reflective, isn't it? The final one, Mark, I wanted to get into, and this is a very difficult one for me, because I feel like I can never criticise a constraint-led approach, and I've tried to, but I feel like there's always an answer to it to some degree. So this idea that the constraint-led approach to coaching always been optimal and always been the best choice didn't seem to sit with you very much, or can you add a wee bit more context to that? Because I really want to find out more about this, because being someone that, again, has an appreciation for experience, memory, doesn't think all drills are evil. I want to kind of know if what you're saying here, if it's helping what I'm thinking, or if it's maybe a bit more nuanced than how I'm looking at things. But what was this myth to start?
Well, I mean, clearly this is a contentious topic in the sense that from the science perspective, it seems that there are two polar camps who have alternative views on this perspective. I mean, personally, I don't have a strong bias towards one perspective or the other. I mean, I've written papers on ecological psychology, dynamical systems. I mean, I am probably more of a cognitive scientist in terms of my background. But I suppose my personal view, right, is I think we're creating what may be called a straw man argument around this, in the sense that if you take a very extreme view of cognitive psychology from 50 years ago and take ecological dynamics in, and then I think you do get, obviously, some significant differences in terms of approach to thinking. But I think over the years there's been, the cognitive psychology approach has developed, it's adapted, it's advanced, and I don't see as much of a difference between the two perspectives now on that continuum. And because people talk about linear and non-linear pedagogy. I was at a talk the other day, and someone was going on about linear pedagogy, and they said that cognitive psychology argues for internal focus of attention. I'm going, really? No, I just think we make up this kind of alternative view, which isn't the case. Having said all of that, in terms of a constraints-based perspective, my personal view is that neither theory provides clear guidelines in terms of what constraints to manipulate and when. So whilst I am a massive proponent of the constraints-based approach, and I do articulate that word clearly, it is an approach. It's not a theory. Yes, the approach is driven by philosophy espoused by ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory. But I wouldn't say it's that out of kilter with a more modern cognitive perspective on the approach either. But I suppose my point of view is that it doesn't really matter whether you're a strong proponent of cognitive psychology or a strong proponent of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory, because neither of it helps you in determining what constraint to manipulate and when. So I fully embrace the philosophy that as coaches, we need to be as hands-off as possible in the process, and that we need to create training environments that are specific to competition. And I think our capacity to manipulate constraints helps us in creating the variability in high levels of specificity and appropriate challenge point to facilitate skill learning. So let me say clearly, I'm a huge fan of the constraints-based approach at a philosophical level. Now then, as to whether I'm an ecological psychologist or a cognitive scientist, neither theory provides me much more guidance beyond that. It doesn't tell me as a coach, okay, what should I manipulate right now because I want to work on quality of the passing, quality of the first touch, quality of finishing in this group of players. So all I have is a philosophy that I need to create variability and specificity by manipulating some aspect of constraint. But in terms of what I change and when, that really comes down to my intuition, my craft knowledge as a coach in terms of deciding what to manipulate and when.
Is it? But I think you kind of, what you allude to there, I think is quite powerful in that what I do see is almost like if you believe, let's say, if you believe from a more information processing view and still versus having a more ecological dynamics philosophy on it, whatever. We're in a space, I think, currently where there's specific language that's almost held prisoner depending on what side of the fence you sit on. It's almost would sound contradictory to say that you could be a coach who believes in idea of modularizing skill development, an idea of maybe chunking up a performance into its constituent parts, but also constraining elements of the practice. That would seem like nonsensical in this day and age because it seems like you're using language that you aren't allowed to associate with things. And actually, I find the way we're taught and the way that we contrast between these things is that, and I've seen it myself, like where information process viewing things, it's about the idea that we remember and then we reparameterize postural cue and the environment. That's how you talk. It then leads on to internal focus of attention is how you coach. The other side of the fence, we see it's more about recognizing affordances, then adapting to them, that sort of idea. And then it's, so that's an external focus of attention. So it's like it creates caricatures of, practically speaking, the way in which we can take the theory forward so it has practical utility. And I think it creates this weird, self-feeding division on thought. And I think when you consider empirically speaking that there are still answers to be there's still questions that can't be answered on either side of the fence, isn't there, in some respects? Where are we getting to then? So it's
and I do think that the division that is going on, and I'm somewhat on the periphery, although when I give podcasts like this I kind of end up moving closer to it, but I really don't want to engage in the argument because I don't think it's a useful argument. So it's divisive. And I think as a field, we'd be better off trying to find some kind of consensus. And I think we'd be better off at trying to avoid the use of complex terminology. I mean, even words like information processing, chaos, perception, action, coupling, I've never used those kind of terminology from either perspective in my framework. I don't know whether you've read, I did a recent paper with Nicky Hodges in Journal of Sports Sciences called the SAFE Framework. What we did is we tried to put it across as action points. So it's this kind of meta-theoretical approach. We've taken account of various theories and we've tried to come across for coaches with action points in terms of how they should put these points, which are really theory-free. I mean, they're philosophy-driven and the theories have an impact on the philosophy. But then again, I'm a big proponent of the fact that coaching is an art form. Coaching is an art. And I think that the art can be informed by science, yes, but there's also a huge amount of professional and craft knowledge that goes into that process. So I don't think we're ever going to get to theories that tell you as a coach, do this in this situation. It's going to give you some guidance, and that guidance guides your philosophy. And really, we could almost remove a lot of this terminology by just talking about concepts of specificity. How do we create specific environments that match competition? Yes, we need variability. Yes, we need to be as hands-off as possible in that particular process. Yes, manipulating constraints provides a great way to create variability and to be less prescriptive in the process. All of the above. So for me, my preference when I deliver coach education stuff is to talk at that level, because I think that's the level that I as a coach understand, and I hope the coaches understand. So I try and stay clear of this heated debate around these two different perspectives, because from my perspective, I don't think it helps a great deal.
No, I couldn't agree
That's
more.
my view, and no doubt people will be having a go at me on various other social media platforms, which I never listen to anyway, to be fair.
No, honestly, but and I think that word is so key. It's philosophy. I think that is so important, because I mean, when I'm even with my students, we talk about style acquisition as a philosophy of thought, because certainly when we're trying to merge it with a coaching, vocational training coaching, like there is the need to look at evidence, recognise it, but be conscious as well of the feel element, be conscious as well of the art form, as you say, and recognising how what sits well on a page and what looks correct in a spreadsheet isn't often what's needed at any one time. And actually, I think there is a wider point, I think, that you allude to there, Matt, around, I think, what are you actually, what's the outcomes that you want to achieve at a more macro level as a coach in a session? Things like tempo, things like representativeness, things like problem solving, things like engagement, fun, that should be what, like, in terms of having a framework for what we're in trying to, what were you pointing your different mechanisms towards? That should be what you're pointing your mechanisms towards, not getting too caught up in actual adherence to strict parameters of thought, because it catches you. It makes you feel like you're doing the right thing by being at that micro level. But I think that's where there's a need to separate academic conversation from the realities and what's useful as a toolkit for a coach to actually take into practice, isn't it?
Yeah. So we could do away with both theories. I mean, okay, the philosophy still guides us, but and I use terminology like specificity, even the concept of representative task design, for instance. I mean, ecological psychologists have grabbed that, and it's a massive part of their agenda. But when has representative task design never been part of the cognitive agenda? I mean, everyone agrees with representative task design. Who wouldn't? The evidence is exceptionally strong in the fact that we should be less prescriptive as coaches. We should be less hands-on. Whatever literature you look at from either theoretical perspective, that's the same conclusion that comes out. The need to create specific practice environments, the need to maintain specificity. That's what perception action coupling is. It's maintaining specificity. It's nothing else. So both theoretical perspectives agree in specificity. So I just don't see what the debate is about and why we need to be. And I don't think has moved the field forward in any great extent over the last 10, 15, 20 years. In fact, to some degree, it's stopped us moving forward by virtue of the fact that, it becomes confusing for coaches. The terminology and the different frameworks, and then coaches see the scientists debating and arguing over debates and arguments that don't exist. And then I just don't think it gives us clarity as a field and helps us to move forward in a practical manner.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what I do think it does serve to do, provided you use it correctly, is I think it allows a coach to access a language that more as a diagnostic tool. I think I found relevance to it as a way of, am I being cohesive in what I'm doing? And I think that's cool to be able to think about, the steps between things, about how you consider the way maybe the brain might work in some respect and how that moves through things. That's useful. But it's, again, don't feel taken captured by it. Don't feel that that's then has to be how you do it. It's, again, what is purposeful ultimately and what is required situationally speaking as well. So yeah, I think it is. I think we do need to get at that space and maybe separate a little bit more.
Maybe just as a simple example, for instance, why do we need to talk about we need to maintain perception action coupling? I mean, of course we do, because the game is full of perception action coupling. So therefore, if you create specific practice environments that match competition, you're going to have perception action coupling. So why do we need to classify as perception action coupling? It just needs to be high specificity so that practice is much competition.
Yeah, it's like coaching fundamentals. You've got fundamentals of the game for the athlete. We have coaching fundamentals that we need to just focus on above all else. So, no, excellent.
I mean, I do come back to this craft of coaching again, and there are numerous points we've discussed in this session. So you think about the challenges, and as a coach, it's hard to see the difference between performance and learning. Okay, so when I deliver my session, I'm constantly making inferences that may or may not be right about whether there's learning taking place. So that's difficult for a coach. I have to be able to set the level of task difficulty for the session to create challenge points and desirable difficulties. That's difficult for a coach because I've often got 16 players in the group, maybe more. And then therefore, what is one player's maintenance practice, for want of a better phrase, is another player's growth practice or deliberate practice. So then, rather than working one-on-one, we're working with groups. And then therefore, by definition, the optimal return on practice is extremely difficult.
100%.
And then, yes, we need to manipulate constraints, but what constraints do we manipulate? When it becomes difficult, and that's when there's a huge amount of intuition and craft knowledge that comes into it. I suppose one of the challenges that I have with constraints-based approach as well is the sense that my personal view is that I think to use the approach optimally, you do need to have a huge amount of craft and intuitive experience of coaching. And you know that if I change this constraint at this time, then this is how behavior will unfold.
Yep.
And that experience accumulates over time because you try things and it works, it doesn't work, or you try something different. So therefore, you have this vast knowledge base around what could be manipulated when and what might be the behavior that might come across. So therefore, as an experienced coach, it makes a lot of sense to coach with that philosophy, always using the medium of the game or the small-sided game to create those types of constraints. But if you're an inexperienced coach, straight off the B-license conveyor belt, for instance, and you're working with kids who are not elite-level kids, then I guess the potential risk is that you may end up abdicating. In other words, you just let them play without manipulating the appropriate constraint at the right time. Or you may end up dictating in the sense that you may put too much constraint on that learning environment.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I am more comfortable with a constraints-based approach with highly experienced, highly skilled coaches working with highly skilled players.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that the approach won't work at the other end of the continuum with inexperienced coaches and less skilled players, but I think I've got more concerns that I have at that level.
Yeah.
To how effective the approach would be and whether we are able to provide the coaches with enough guidance as to what to manipulate in that.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I suppose anecdotally, I mean, when I teach students through different pedagogies, particularly inexperienced coaches, the constraint-based one's always the toughest for them to grasp. And I think, considering the stage that they're at in their journey, because coaches are very easy at getting in their own way, should we be forcing them to try and digest a language and a way of doing things that actually, ironically, constrains what they feel capable of doing at any one time and stops them from getting on with developing their craft by just focusing on things that are more intuitive at points, or not necessarily just more intuitive? That isn't necessarily the case. We don't want that either. We do want a space where there's a framework that's useful, but base the framework, practically speaking, on what the coaches need at their own stage. And then from there, because I always think a pedagogy is most powerful when you can have input from the athlete as well to some point. And again, it's harder for a coach to get their head around some of the ideas as constraints. You can't then, it's very difficult to get an athlete's input in that space when they're a beginner athlete potentially. But we're in a space where, philosophically speaking, if ecological, or let's just say a constraint-led approach is saying that actually, if you want an athlete to become that really adaptive player, you start from the point where they come. So then it's again, more pressure on the coach starting with kids to get them into this space, and they must learn this strategy. And it's well, they just need to allow coaches space sometimes to find their own way to a point. And then as they do enough good at their craft that they can digest it and put them in somewhere else.
Or maybe if we spin it around, I'm agreeing with you, but maybe if we spin it around in a slightly different way, I guess, in the sense that maybe the biggest challenge we have is how do we better support coaches in regards to putting this constraints-based framework into action, so to speak, in the sense that we can go and do the courses on the A license, the B license, the Pro license, deliver the material, put the philosophy forward. Whichever theoretical approach, you don't know whether you go with the strong theoretical backdrop or not, the philosophy remains the same. So then we've provided an approach to them. Now, how do we then scaffold some kind of ongoing coach development process around that? And who does that? Is that the role of a skill acquisition specialist? Is it the role of other more experienced coaches who would work with the more junior coaches to try and provide advice and guidance around which of these constraints to manipulate in that kind of context? I don't think we've to my knowledge, fully addressed that issue yet. And a bit of a gap that I think we could look as to how we might develop some kind of scaffolding to better help coaches in that transition.
Yeah. Well, I had a conversation just a couple of episodes back with Sean Miska, who's a skill acquisition specialist in the NFL, and it was that whole conversation: do we outsource this as coaches to people that are able to build that knowledge? Well, maybe in a sense to avoid coaches again getting in their own way when they're developing their own craft. We don't always need to be the harbourers of knowledge in every respect, but again, maybe it's part of an interdisciplinary team that helps make up those issues, those divides. But
and I can see at least two perspectives to it, Mark, in the sense that I guess I'm wearing two hats in a football perspective as a coach and as a skill acquisition specialist. I feel that if I was working in that football environment, then I'm able to pull on my professional knowledge of the skill acquisition literature and the craft knowledge of the sport. And I'm able to provide some guidance from both perspectives, having been in that situation and have an understanding that if I change X, this is the behavior Y that may emerge out of it. I suppose it would be harder for me, per se, to go into a sport like volleyball, for instance, or field hockey, because I don't have the craft knowledge around it. I have the professional knowledge, and I can advise around the professional knowledge aspect of it. But maybe, again, this is where you need more of an ongoing discourse and conversation between, and you almost need a very experienced coach and a skill acquisition specialist to work with coaches, in the sense that, because the skill acquisition people are going to come up with maybe broad conceptual ideas that may have an impact, whereas obviously the football or the specific experienced coach is going to come up with craft knowledge that also impacts on the process. So we need to do a lot better at trying to integrate both the craft and the professional knowledge that underpins development in a learning environment. Maybe we've not done that particularly well. I mean, certainly on the skill acquisition side, I mean, I think the Premier League have a scheme in place, but I don't know specifically what they're doing. Australia is currently investing a lot in the skill acquisition side because of the fact they've got the Olympics coming back to Brisbane in 2032. Australia. So I think in some instances, more of these skill acquisition people are getting involved in that environment. But I think certainly in the previous decade or so, when this discussion's been going on, there probably has been the lack of direct influence by skill acquisition people into the day-to-day coaching process. That's been left more so to experienced coaches to do that sort of guidance. But maybe we need to look at this as another constraints-based triangle. So the three corners in which this triangle probably is good for everything in life. But, the three corners of it would be the skill acquisition practitioner, the experienced coach with high levels of craft knowledge, and then the inexperienced coach. And then you get that dynamic interaction between them to decide, how do we develop that young coach in a way.
Yeah, sounds very easy. Sounds easy, that, doesn't it? So, yeah, we'll come back in 50 years and see if we're any better off. So, yeah, it's an amazing subject to get into, as it's foreign, and I think that's why this conversation's been really helpful, just to get into this. But importantly, actually, we've not just come up with new problems, we've actually answered some things as well. So, thanks so much, Matt. I think we've covered everything there in the time that we've got today. So, yeah, I just must say thanks so much for being available and sharing your view on these things. If anyone's, on LinkedIn, I would really encourage you, hopefully that's okay, Mark, to say I would encourage them to try and connect or follow you, because you make really great posts like the ones that, started this conversation, and it's a real great learning source in a way, and And obviously Mark's got a lot of books, academic textbooks, but also journal articles that are on loads of different varied topics around this space. Again, I would encourage anyone to go and look at that if they can, please. Yeah.
And listen, thanks for the invitation to come and talk. I mean, it was a fairly long debate. I see debate as being healthy. And of course, most of these are my opinion, with some good input from you as well. And I guess the aim is to create more discussion, more open conversation and discussion around these issues, because I do think that they're crucially important because of the challenges that I've highlighted before. I mean, an interesting question that I've raised a few times is, for every hour of practice, what proportion of that practice transfers to a meaningful improvement in performance in competition? And of course, we can't measure that. It's extremely difficult. But I suspect if we could measure it, we'd probably be disappointed. Whatever the figure might be. I mean, let's throw out a figure of 30% in there, whatever it might be. If we could, then it would probably be lower than what we expect because of all the various issues that I've highlighted over the course of this last couple of hours. But at the same time, of course, what we want to do is, if it is 30%, then we want to try and get it to 40%, and we want to try and get it to 50%. So the key questions here are, how do we optimize the use of practice time to facilitate enhanced skill learning and development? For me, that's a very crucial question within sport generally, and it's probably a very quite crucial question from a societal perspective, in the sense of high skill learning across all professional domains, so that we can improve the different sectors and environment that we're involved in.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more, Mark. No, thank you so much. And thank you for those that have listened to this episode. I hope you found that even a tenth is as informative as I certainly have, and as useful as I have. So thanks so much to Mark personally. And yeah, to those that listen, I will see you next time. Thank you.
Cheers now.